You made an interesting point by suggesting that during our time as members of the European Union, our universities have improved and more so than others. We've so up the league table. Do you attribute, to some extent at least, that to our membership of the European Union?
Well, I think we're quite different. And I spent last week in Berlin, and it's quite interesting whether you go to France, Germany, Greece, very, very open universities. But what we've got in this country is a whole spectrum of universities. The ones that are playing right at the top of the league, Trinity College, Cambridge, the leading college in the world, is high. It's the high quality. It's making sure that people come from all over the world without let or hindrance and attract the funding that they need, and the staff that teach them. 50% of our staff are from outside the UK.
Can I just add to that? Maybe one of the other things I think is quite important is that the UK has played quite a leading role actually in things like the previous framework programs, research framework programs. Been very successful, built up collaborations, recognised by other EU member states and others internationally, the role that we've played in research, and also around our use, I suppose, in the UK of structural funds, which is another key element of EU funding to support the development of the higher education infrastructure, particularly as anchor institutions. And I think it's going to be a very key part of this process that is not lost, and that we mitigate that with some kind of replacement process.
Now, we're going to go into a sort of a set of negotiations which effectively mean that we're not going to get everything we want. We might be surprised, but negotiations are what they are. They're with 27 other nation states and indeed with the European Union structures. So, is there anything that you think that is possible for us to accept that we might have to sacrifice?
Yeah,
Alistair?
so I would say two things, and I would hope that we wouldn't use the word sacrifice, but we'd probably use the word fund ourselves rather than fund from the EU. European structural funding is very important for the UK, but the UK, I believe, doesn't get as much out of it as they put in. And structural funding can also come with quite a few strings attached, can come with quite a few risks, and can be quite hard to manage. So if we were able to replace the amount of structural funding with our own funds, that's a real opportunity that we could not only retain all that's best in that system, but actually make it an even better system. Just one other thing that I would point out there, it's not the same issue as Horizon 2020 and Framework 9 funding, where the quality of the partners and our European research collaborators is crucial. This is different, ESIF funding. This is something we can do on our own. Another thing that we could, if we had to sacrifice it, another thing that we could possibly manage on our own is Erasmus+. At the moment, Erasmus Plus is an extremely valuable way of allowing students and staff to go abroad. I think over 15,000 students went abroad last year with Erasmus Plus. But again, that is something that we could consider funding ourselves.
Okay. Any other additional points?
It worries me that in Switzerland, in Erasmus, not only are they paying for people to come in, they're also now paying, of course, them to go out. Yeah. The irony is, of course, 950 years ago, Oxford was created because Henry II said they couldn't go to Paris anymore. 500 years ago, Erasmus came and brought the first influx of students from the lowlands to Corpus, to establish Corpus. So we're giving up 500, 950 years worth of exchange. I think we need to be very cautious, and I think actually we need to push the negotiation beyond this management of risk and actually be imaginative. And I mean that in all sincerity. We need to raise money, but we need to make sure that actually we improve the exchange, not become insular. It worries me whether it's research funding or it's capital investment. What we've seen in America, and we're heading into, as you say, just a few minutes ago, to Trump's administration, what we've seen in America over the last 5-10 years has been a reduction in the way in which their NIH funding flows out with. Their collaborative publications have fallen off. Their impact is beginning to drop. And I can tell you that our worry is that China and India are in the ascendancy, and we have been second only to the US. We need to be very sure that we negotiate the kind of openness that academic is all about.
Okay, thank you. Catherine, what I'd like to ask you is, because you've mentioned a bespoke deal, so to speak, what does that look like in your eyes?
Well, one possibility is an EEA plus or minus, which would cover all sectors. Another possibility is we have sectoral-specific deals, and that there is a sectoral-specific deal for higher education, which does guarantee free movement of researchers, students, academic and academic-related staff, in much the same way as occurs at present. Now, the advantage is that it would maintain the very open labour market that we have in higher education. We've already heard the numbers of non-UK staff who are working in British universities, which is to our benefit. And of course, it's to our comparative advantage, because we're net recipients of EU staff coming into the UK. They've been trained, funded elsewhere. We benefit from what they bring to us. We receive more than we send. So a possible bespoke deal is, instead of having it across all sectors, you focus on particular sectors. Of course, here we're talking about higher education, and that would be a possibility much on the same basis that we've got at the moment. The point I would like to stress, you're talking about opportunities post-Brexit. Well, one of the opportunities is, of course, that we don't prioritise EEA nationals as we do at present, but what I think we would all hope is that any visa scheme that is introduced, if there is no bespoke deal, is not like the one we've got at the moment. The visa scheme at the moment is extremely cumbersome. It's highly labour intensive for the universities and for the colleges that have to administer it. The penalties if we get things wrong are very serious, and the costs for individual students and for researchers is high. And so if you're looking at a Tier 4 visa, you're talking about £350 or so pounds. And if you're talking about Tier 2 visa, you know, you're depending on how long they're here for, £500 to £1,000. So it's extremely costly. And I should say that although there's lots of emphasis on border control and take back control of our borders, in reality, it's not border control that manages immigration. It's employers who manage immigration, applying government requirements.
Yeah.
And so that is our great concern, that that we have to apply a full visa scheme to both EU and non-EU migrant workers.
Okay. In a short sentence, could each of you say what you think the implications are for the sector if we end up with a hard Brexit? I know that term is controversial itself, but I think you know what I mean. Alistair.
You risk damaging one of your best industries, which is a knowledge-based economy in this country.
It would make us, I think, extremely uncompetitive in terms of the way in which people would view us. I think there is a short-term and a long-term impact on that.
Catherine?
Personal implications for the EU staff who are already here, lots of uncertainty, their lives turned upside down, and of course it promptly cuts off the flow of excellent people who are coming at the moment.
It would probably be the biggest disaster for the university sector in many years.
Right, Alistair, you're going to be in charge of Brexit for Oxford, so to speak. Can you just quickly tell us what that looks like in terms of your plans ahead?
So it's a big challenge, and it's not something that you go into lightly. I think there's opportunities, and I worry, as I said earlier, that we're spending our whole time mitigating the risks that we all identify, and we're not actually thinking in a strategic way as to how we really do what universities in this country do well, which is to be multidisciplinary, be really quite global in the outreach. Medical school in Oxford's done pretty well in the last 6 years. It's been top rated, and there are reasons for that. The three reasons are that the quality of our students is second to none. The quality of the staff is absolutely second to none. They come from all over the world, and increasingly we are doing things in a distributed way, not colonial, but actually with people in Kenya, with people in Thailand, on the Thai-Burmese border, in Vietnam, and we're doing things that make this university quite global in its reach. So I think one of the advantages of going through Brexit is that we start doing things in a much more creative way around the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Ian, it's your turn for some questions.
Yes, United Kingdom universities have a reputation as being respected worldwide, as being top rated, as you said yourself, Professor Buchan. Although I must admit I'm not a great fan of Manchester United, so I'm not necessarily agree with that analogy. But to what degree has the success of UK universities been dependent on membership of the European Union for the last 40 years?
So I think it's not been. The universities have been members of the European Union for, as I said earlier, 950 years. And what's happened in the last 30, 40 years is that freedom of movement, that freedom of students, and critically, and it's not just the money coming into the academic environment, it's actually the collaboration. It's being able to lead studies that involve 600 million people. Why would you go from 600 million people when you're trying to set up big data cohorts for clinical epidemiology to suddenly being reduced to 50, 60 million people? You wouldn't do that. Why would you draw talent from 50, 60 million people when you can draw talent for 600 million people? And I think that being part of Europe has given the UK universities a huge advantage. It's quite interesting when you go to Germany or you go to France or even the US or Australia. They're desperately trying to do what we've done, which is to keep the research institute activity, the sort of Max Planck's, the Helmholtz's, that the core science, bringing it back into universities. We risk in this country doing the opposite, and I think that would be a risk going forward. How do we keep the really strong science absolutely base paired with the teaching? And I think it's not just the quality, it's the fact that our teaching is absolutely coupled. It's yoked to research. That's quite different in most places, and part of that's to do with the fact that we've kept our universities relatively small compared to big public universities in Europe or the US.
I think exactly the same. I think there are two elements here. One is the opportunity that Europe has given us to actually have this freedom of movement of individuals from the UK out into Europe, working in networks of European universities, then coming back. I think the scale, which is very important. I think, as Alistair said, access to a much bigger market, but actually the ability to very easily, currently under the way in which the EU works, bring people together and work in collaborations that we'll find it very difficult to do, perhaps, afterwards, or certainly not as easy from a legislative or regulative point of view. That's really been a big scale. And I think the other thing is that being recognised as part of a significant economic grouping globally has taken and given us some advantage in the international market. And I think what we've got to make sure is we protect all of those elements, or at least replace them as we go through a Brexit process.
I would just like to add that the UK system is an open and meritocratic system. It's also quite a flat system in comparison to our continental counterparts. And for that reason, young researchers, if they're good, do very well. They don't have to spend years bag carrying for a senior professor before they can make progress. And that's deeply appealing to those from other states, and therefore we have benefited very much from having an open system. And of course we do benefit from our inherent advantage of having English as our mother tongue, and of course it's such a widely spoken language.
Your question was, why have we been able to advance with our European partners? So just let me give you some statistics on that. Just under 50% of UK research involved overseas partners. That's higher than for the US or Japan or Canada. Does that matter? Does that contribute to the quality of your research? Well, most people will tell you that the best indicator of research quality is field-weighted citation impact. In 2013, the UK overtook the USA to rank first in the world in that key research metric. Why does Europe matter? Well, 5 of the UK's top 10 partners for international research are EU partner states with full access to Horizon 2020, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands and Spain. So the evidence is absolutely clear that that's been a crucial part in the advancement of our country's research.
Thank you very much. Is it necessarily the case, though, that changes to freedom of movement rules will halt the flow of talented academics in and out of the United Kingdom?
Should I answer that?
Yeah,
it touches upon the point I raised earlier about visas. The visa regime is problematic. Mm-hmm. It's expensive. It's both in terms of cost to the individual. So a Tier 2 visa for an academic is £575 if you apply outside the EU for a 3-year visa, and £575 for each family member. Is over £1,000 if you apply.
So in terms of managing the Brexit process, would you as academics be looking for finessing of the visa system in order to allow a freer flow of academia to and from Europe after Brexit.
Absolutely, and of course you remember with the Tier 2 visa there's a cap on the number of Tier 2 visas that are on offer. I think it's about 20,700, and of course the numbers of EU nationals who are working within the UK at the moment means we hit up very quickly against that cap, that nationwide cap. And the bureaucracy in managing the visas for the individual departments or the individual colleges or universities have got to comply with that. They need a compliance department to ensure they do comply, because, of course, the sanctions are very serious if we don't. It's really a major issue if there is a full visa regime being applied to all of these EU staff and students.
Well, I think it's very important also to recognise around the world there are many countries, and particularly countries who are seen as either fast developers or innovative in their own way, which have a graded visa system. In other words, there are certain countries I can turn up with my UK passport and I'm straight in, I don't have a problem. It's much easier for me to get through. There are certain countries I can't. And so that, what we need to make sure is that we have in place the appropriate system which allows us to gain access. And certainly EU member states, for me, would be quite a key element, because 9% of my staff at the moment are European staff. That's quite a significant proportion of the staff at Coventry coming through. And just looking at the students, 2,000 of our students are European students. So that whole process of how we maintain that very, very good relationship that we have at the moment, a key element of our current operation is focusing around Europe.
So how can the UK government promote the idea that the UK and academia, the higher education sector in this country, remains open for business post-Brexit?
Well, I think there are parts of the elements, of course. The part of the problem we have now is we're going into a negotiation. We don't want necessarily to show our hands immediately. But, of course, one of the nice things to do is to give surety. One of the issues that we're facing here is a short-term and a long-term impact. While there is not surety, people are uncomfortable to commit themselves to either come or go. Until you've got a system in place which people will understand how it's going to operate, it's going to be very difficult for people to have all of the comfort, because you can broadcast in as much as you want, we're open for business, we remain extremely competitive. So there's the short-term issue of the negotiation and what that ends up with, and then there's the regime that exists afterwards, and how open do we appear to be and remain to be open in terms of the way in which we operate.
Now, Professor Barnard, you mentioned about us, of course, being an English-speaking nation, and that English is commonly used as a second language across the European Union. Are you aware of any disadvantages that the UK would have, say, as opposed to other English-speaking nations, in terms of attracting European academics post-Brexit?
Well, I think the answer to that is that Ireland in particular is already seeing Brexit as an opportunity for expanding Irish universities, because of course they share a lot of the common traits that we have, English of course, and also a very meritocratic system too. And indeed in their most recent budget they had a budget line for what they call Brexit refugees, so to try and attract good staff from British universities. Germany also working very hard to see if they can attract British academics or academics in British universities to Germany, offering positions which have no teaching connected, research-based posts. And of course in Germany a lot of the academic work is now done in English, so Germany is snapping at our heels, and particularly in the field of maths, the German universities are really looking to tap into the pool of talent that we're getting from Hungary and Poland in order to come to their universities. So other universities in other member states see Brexit as an opportunity and to undercut, because we at the moment, it's a tall poppy. We are the tall poppy. We get more ERC, European Research Council funding, than any other member state. We are seen as the best. Germany is number 2 in terms of attracting European funding, but significantly behind. And they want some of that action.
Can I just add in there? I think the Netherlands in particular, I was talking to some Vice-Chancellors from Dutch universities the other day, see Brexit as a real opportunity for them to grow their higher education sector. And I think also Scandinavia to a certain extent, again because of the high level of use of English and delivery of education in English.
We could easily lose our best players, not just in terms of academics, but actually in the healthcare system. And actually one of the bigger risks we haven't addressed is the way education comes together with health professional training and the revalidation and qualification. Absolutely essential that our doctors are able to be qualified not just in the UK, but have a passport and a qualification that works across Europe.
Okay, thank you. Lillian,
Chair, before we move on this question, obviously I'm sure government ministers will be looking carefully at the answers that you've given today, and I know individual institutions and groups of institutions have put forward their views. Have government actually come to you and sought your advice on what are the things that we need to do to protect our higher education sector within these negotiations?
I would say largely no, but UUK has been very active in trying to get a message out there and trying to engage ministers. I would also say that the Minister for Higher Education, Joe Johnson, he's been welcoming towards our ideas in general. We feel he's a supporter of these ideas. Yeah.
To be fair, I should say that David Davis has been to Cambridge quite recently.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of discussion going on, particularly with Joe Johnson and a number of other individuals around what are the areas that we need to look at and what kind of systems we need to put in place.
So one message you could give back in your evidence is that in the Department for Exiting the EU, DEXU, there is no structure within that department that we can talk to. There's no base pairing. There's nobody responsible for research, for education, for the universities. Likewise, in the Department of Education, there's nobody really responsible for leaving the EU. So there's a real need to see who it is that's the channel, the portal for giving the information to. Yes, they're very hungry for information. I spent a lot of time explaining to them how it works. And actually the education of ministers, the education of civil servants is could be greatly helped by having a better communication system.
Very important point. Thank you very much. Marion.
Yes, I think I'm going to be Pollyanna this morning. I'm going to be looking at what opportunities do you believe Brexit could actually offer higher education.
So I think the first thing is it allows the higher education to really get involved and stuck into the industrial strategy. And I really feel very strongly about that. And actually, as we change regulations, we need to make sure that the regulatory changes benefit the way we work, particularly in areas like the pharmaceutical industry, clinical trials, management of data, patient data. The NHS is another of our crown jewels in this country. We have national treasures. The NHS, the universities are but two. How do we make sure that they really help us with the industrial strategy?
Just before Mary asks her next question, could you tell us what you think the industrial strategy is?
The industrial strategy is the industrial strategy.
Sorry. It's a bit like that's a bit like Brexit means Brexit. Carry on, Marie.
I could go on further about industrial strategy in relation to steel, but I won't. I wonder, could you perhaps, all of you, take a reach at this one? Do you think Brexit could give universities opportunities to redirect students and mobilise them going towards academic cooperation in other parts of the world and sending students on exchanges to other parts of the world?
I think it allows you to strengthen what we do in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands, in Sweden. It actually now is forcing us to really build up those links in the way that many universities have built around the world. And I think, yes, two things. One, it does push us to doing things right across the world. And secondly, I actually think it motivates us to strengthen our European links.
Interesting. I do.
I agree with that, actually. I think there are many things. I mean, we are all global institutions these days anyhow, and Europe is an element of what we deliver. Mm-hmm. So what effectively Brexit is doing, fundamentally, is taking a part of our operation and moving it from being home to being international, and I think we need to recognise that for a lot of us that's quite a significant part of our operation. So how do we actually maintain the strength that exists from those key collaborations that we've got? We've already heard, a lot of the really good maths and engineering students that we get coming to the UK to study our institutions come from Eastern Europe, for example. So what do we do around our focus on supporting those relationships directly with Eastern Europe? Some of our other countries in Western Europe are our key research collaborators in terms of what we do. So what do we do in those areas to actually promote and retain that relationship? But I think also it does give us an opportunity, as everyone is, to go more global more quickly, I suppose. And so we'll drive through some of those changes that we're having. And we're already seeing universities, from the UK in particular, setting up more and more operations on a global scale. And to a certain extent, we would look at those European collaborators the same as we'd look at our other international collaborators. And the key element for universities are networks of individuals, or networks of research competence, or networks of education providers, of which some are European at the moment and many are international. So it's just the way in which you have that ability to maintain that growth. So there's a way of mitigating it. I think one of the ways I would look at it is that Brexit is not giving us particularly more advantage to do things. It's not particularly taking things away. It's just the way in which you do things is probably going to be different.
Could I add to that obviously I share what's already been said, but I would add it would also give us an opportunity to review our visa system, which doesn't work effectively at the moment, and obviously works significantly to the detriment of Indian, Chinese students. And so it would, of course, give us the opportunity to look much more globally, but also to have a rethink about how we welcome those students into our system and those academics into our system. I would, however, sound a note of caution that students coming from, for example, India, often do not have the resources to pay overseas fees. And so there will be a cost involved, because if we want to get the best students from India and China, we will have to give far more in terms of bursaries and scholarships. And the same will apply to Eastern European students. If I just look at my own students at Trinity, the best Eastern European students we've got, who at the moment, of course, pay home fees, not overseas fees, they already get bursaries from the college to support them because their family income is so low. And of course, if the fees go from the current 9,000 a year to 17, 18,000 or more, depending on what subjects they're doing, of course they will be demanding of more money, because otherwise they just cannot come. So there will be a cost to the institutions in terms of being more global, in terms of attracting these excellent people.
Let me give you a specific example of how we could make an opportunity out of a problem. We mentioned Erasmus Plus funding before as something that I absolutely agree with Alistair will be loath to lose, but if we had to sacrifice something, we could use the money that we put into Erasmus Plus, and we could end up with perhaps Erasmus Plus Plus, which has all the advantages of Erasmus Plus, but reaches all around the world instead of just to Europe. That's an imaginative way of turning Brexit to our advantage. And I think there are many more possibilities.
No, I have to recalibrate every time I hear about student fees, of course, because we don't pay any in Scotland. Another opportunity, do you think it may be that Brexit would offer the opportunity for the government and universities to ensure that research investment is spread more evenly across all the country? Because there is a perception at the moment that it's very much here and in larger centres, but wouldn't it be better if, Oxford, Cambridge, maybe because of their kudos, get more research funding from Europe or wherever, but the government and the university could perhaps then spread it out to other areas?
Can I say something about that? There is a perception that there is great concentration of research funding, but we need to be fair and factual about this. Roughly a third of government research funding is given out in the REF, in QR quality related research. That is an exercise carried out by peer review where anybody can enter, and if you're good enough, you will get the funding. The other 2/3 is given out by the research councils, roughly, and pretty much the rules are the same there. So the view that there is some plot which concentrates research funding, I think is largely not backed by evidence. Our system is very much a meritocracy, which is if you're good enough in the judgment of your peers, you will get the research funding. So I have faith in that system.
So if I can add to that,
Sure.
Quality is everything, and
Yes.
the research investment has got to be at the highest possible quality. There's a need to collaborate, and in fact, within Europe, it's been a big problem getting research funding out to Eastern Europe, and it's now incumbent upon us in working with Europe to partner and to help bring up that quality. But you can never sacrifice absolute quality in terms of research funding, or you will not get the investment.
Well, I think I would totally agree with Alistair's comment as well. You know, all of our institutions actually have got elements of quality research and receive funding from both Europe, non-Europe, and internationally. My own institution currently runs at about 25% of our research funding comes from Europe, either through Horizon 2020 or other programs. But a reasonable percentage of that funding also comes internationally, in terms of foundations that we work with around the world and work that we're doing. And, you know, increasing levels of funding comes from the research councils in the UK and directly from industry, in terms of where we are. So I think we have to protect the issue that you will fund research where there is the expertise and the quality to enable that to continue to take place. And I think that one of the elements that we have to ensure is that we still retain the opportunity for the academics and the research centres to work collaboratively with the best partners wherever they happen to be.
But if I can just again add, the quality of that then of course attracts money from all over the world, Gates Foundation, Li Ka-shing, wherever, and critically philanthropy. The fact that we're working in Europe with access to 600 million people has brought in enormous worldwide revenues into the UK that we're putting at risk if we don't get this right.
Okay, Marion, thank you. Just one question. Of course, there's another opportunity, isn't there, which is universities working with business in the sort of pursuit of export opportunities and innovation opportunities beyond. Is that something that you've got in mind?
I think that's something that we always have in mind, and I think there are lots of mechanisms already in our system, high funding, Innovate UK, that help us to do that. We already work a lot with companies. Oxford Brookes is one of the few universities that makes over £2 million a year from just one licence. So we've always got that on our radar.
Good.
And again, we've seen a big investment. So OSI and Oxford has announced this week are putting in 500 million because OUI, the Oxford University Innovation, is the leading innovations for Europe. And that is really helping the UK economy in a European world.
Yeah, but of course that means in the context of Brexit that we've got to be more global in our ambitions there.
Absolutely.
Catharine.
I wanted to go into slightly more depth on the movement of students within Europe in, currently and post-Brexit. How likely do you think it is that there can be a reciprocal deal entered into to ensure that EU students will be able to have that freedom of movement to come and study here in the UK? And UK students overseas as well.
I'll start off. Being a student many years ago who took advantage of an Erasmus programme and actually went and did some of my time overseas, I think that the whole concept of student mobility, international student mobility, let's start from there, never mind whether it's into Europe or not into Europe, is a key element of developing global citizens. And actually the ability for students who are studying in other countries to come and study in the UK adds fundamentally to any education development process of individuals. So we start from a freedom of movement of students to be able to come and study and go and study as being quite key. And I think Alistair's key point around Erasmus Plus really has put a framework in place that's made that very easy to do. Now we've got the expertise in that program. Now we can see the undeniable benefit of an Erasmus type program. Going to a global program where actually we can look to support movement of individuals wherever they wish to go and study. And many of the students at Coventry spend a lot of their time now going and studying and spending time outside of Europe as much as they do inside of Europe. I think the Erasmus Plus opportunities are significant. If we can retain a position within the Erasmus Plus programme, pay our contribution, enable free movement, I think that would definitely be a benefit. It would be something I would vote for rather than vote against. But for me, it's about really now we need global programmes, of which a European programme is part. Because fundamentally, a lot of the markets that we're operating in, both UK PLC, but also the university sector, are all around the world.
And Professor Barnard, you've spoken quite clearly about some of the challenges that currently face movement of international students in terms of the visa system. I'm certainly detecting that you identify this as, yes, a risk, but also an opportunity to improve the movement of students right across the board. But taking on board, I appreciate your appreciation that we can't show our hands in the negotiations. What can the government do now, and what would you like them to see them do post-Brexit to actually make sure that we do maximise that opportunity?
So, in answer to your specific question, what can the government do now? For me, the most important thing is to have a commitment as soon as possible for the next round of student entry in 2018, that EU students will carry on paying it will be still subject to the home and EU rate. So crucial, I realise, not for Scotland, but for England, were absolutely crucial. The government, very late in the day, made that guarantee for 2017, but only 3 days before the closing date for Cambridge applications.
Until the completion of their studies.
Until the completion of their studies, absolutely crucial, and that they get the student loan finance to support them. I should say that this year we've seen at Cambridge a 14% reduction in the number of applications from the European Union or at undergraduate level, although I should say the numbers of applications from EU students at postgraduate level have actually gone up. In respect of those who have declined an offer from Cambridge at postgraduate level, we have put a question in the so-called decliners survey to say, what was it that dissuaded you from coming? And those who answered the question offered a range of factors, from a concern about anti-immigrant sentiment to devaluation of the pound and the fact that their scholarships would be worth less, although obviously not in the UK, and uncertainty over future research collaboration. Now, that's really important, and this feeds into what we've been saying now, that if the government could give some commitments, longer-term commitments about carrying on supporting higher education through either replacement of the European Research Council funding or other funding, and to say that we are absolutely open for business. I think these sorts of messages would be really important going forward.
Okay.
Could I say something about the numbers? There was, interestingly, some polling done by Hobson's after the referendum, and the result of that was that 43% of prospective international students from all over the world felt that Brexit had affected their decision to study in the UK, and of those students, 83% said it made them less likely to study in the UK. So it's an international problem. What we would like right now is for the government to publicly affirm the value that they place on the EU and international students and staff as well. I believe if you just look at it in the cold, hard economic light of exports, international students is our country's third biggest export. We know also, we understand that there are conversations about immigration. We understand many people have strong views about immigration, but the two statistics I would give you is that in other polls, we've shown that only a very small percentage of the population regards international students as immigrants. And we also believe there is evidence that only 1% of international students overstay. So even if you wanted to reduce immigration hugely, you can't do that by reducing the number of international students.
I was going to say, I think the ability to lose market share of students coming is something that can happen very quickly. To regain it back can take many years. And so I think there is a definite issue here around how we manage the process through so that people understand we are remaining open for business. It is a good place to come and study, but without a surety, because don't forget, if you're an 18-year-old, you're travelling halfway around the world, and you're not too sure what fees you're going to pay in 2 or 3 years' time against an exchange rate that may or may not continue to go in the direction that it's going, you're going to be very unsettled about making a commitment.
Can I just ask, before Catharine continues, because one of the things that we find is quite a lot of the commentary about movement of people in connection with this whole sector is at this point too anecdotal, too speculative. We need hard evidence to inform our thinking and our deliberations. So if you have that evidence, not necessarily now, please send it to us.
If I can speak to that, I'm a clinician, so I worry that we need to make a diagnosis here, and I worry really that we haven't really understood the cause of what's been going on. And from my point of view, 2 absolutely iconic, world-class offerings from the UK, the NHS and the universities, are somehow being criticised by the population in a way that's probably unhelpful to the UK, to our society. And yes, you're right. The evidence of the criticism is a worry. Oxford is setting up a Brexit observatory to try and collect systematic data. But beyond that, I think the problem actually with us, with both healthcare provision and the university sector, is that we haven't convinced people. We haven't actually adduced the evidence in a way of how good we are, in a way that's been through the media, through the politicians, been really put us where we need to be, which is a treasure. And it worries me that the reproducibility of our science, the reproducibility of our clinical interventions haven't always been faithful. And I think one of the causes of Brexit is actually our own fault. We've not been on top of that whole business of reproducibility.
Okay. Thank you. Catharine.
Yeah, but from a very current, immediate, practical perspective, in order to put, an evidence base for some of the very immediate effects that you're potentially seeing, I think would be very valuable, because I know many universities, including my hometown, Newcastle University, have raised concern in the decline in the number of EU students and the impact that would have on university finances and income. And so it would be helpful if you could also comment and, if possible, provide evidence to follow of the impact that could potentially already be having and will have in the future in terms of very much the issue that you outlined, Professor Buchan, of maintaining our position as a global leader.
But the evidence needs to be properly collected.
It does. And consistently collected against a number of key indicators.
I mean, is it something that you're seeing already?
As I say, we have the data, we have seen a 14.1%, to be absolutely accurate, reduction in the number of EU applicants to Cambridge in this current round, which is we're just completing at the moment. But at postgraduate level, the numbers have gone up, and actually the numbers of UK students wanting to do postgraduate work in the EU has gone up, possibly because they recognise there may be a relatively small window when they currently enjoy the same treatment as...
And why do you think there's been an increase in postgraduate applications as opposed to undergraduate? Just the risk factors are slightly
part of the issue is the
less
long-term
intimidating,
risk, isn't it? If you're doing a course which is 3 or 4 years in duration compared to one which is a year, possibly 15 months in duration, then the risk factor is very different. And at the moment, we're still in. Let's be perfectly honest. So if you start, within this sort of September coming, chances are you'll still be part of that process as you go through. The real issue, which I think is we highlighted earlier, is what happens the year after. What happens the year after that? And I think we just need to concentrate. I think most universities have got 1 or 2 strategies running at the moment. One is to maximise the opportunities that remain while we remain in, and then what do you do as part of the process after we've left the EU.
And are universities already making strategies for, because I know some universities are already modelling a reduction in EU student applications,
Absolutely.
and so what, in the spirit of maximising opportunities, are universities already looking at ways of making up those loss of numbers and that loss of income?
Can I say something about that? We have some sector figures because we have UCAS, at least for undergraduates. The sector figures at the moment are that the number of EU applicants applying to enter in September 2017 is just under 10% lower than last year. Remember, that's with the guarantee. So they know that they're going to be entering and keeping their status as EU students. That's a worrying figure. Let me say as well that in answer to your question, you might think that universities would have two strategies in the face of declining EU students. One would be to recruit more UK students, another would be to recruit more international students. Well, we've already talked about how increasingly difficult it is to recruit more international students, and I should remind you as well that we are just going through, as far as UK students are concerned, we're just going through a demographic dip. There are fewer 18 to 20-year-olds now, and I believe that will continue for another two years before it picks up again. So in answer to your question, it's quite hard to formulate strategies.
But the quality of the postgraduate research students is absolutely paramount in terms of driving the research activity in the country, and actually that's where the largest proportion are actually coming from Europe, and that's a 3, 4, 5 year plus postdoc. You know, that's really, really a big worry to me.
Can I just pick up on a point that was made earlier about the fact that perhaps we as a sector have failed to make the case for the value of having international global universities. I should say that there was a poll commissioned by Universities UK, by Comres, about public attitudes towards international students. And 75% of the respondents said they would like to see the same number of international students in the UK, and that figure jumped to 87% once the information on the economic benefits of international students was provided. Now, this is where there is a tension in public policy terms, because, of course, the government is committed to getting the numbers of immigrants down to the tens of thousands. And I think we would say that we feel very strongly that students should not be included in the immigration figures, because international students are here, they're here for a short period of time. There is public support from the same research which suggests that international students should be allowed to work for a number of years in the UK after they've finished their studies. So there is high-level public support for those sorts of students to stay, and we do think they should be coming out of the immigration figures, because we think they skew the immigration figures and they're not truly representative, because most of them are only here for 3 or 4 years and then go. And of course they are young and they're not a burden on the system in a way that others might become.
I think so to add to that, the really sad thing for me is the fact that if you get a really good student coming to study in the UK, they might come and study initially to improve their English so they can go on to do a university undergraduate course. They then do very well, and they then move on to do a postgraduate course and maybe then stay on and become a researcher. At the moment, they're 4 immigrations, but they're only one person.
But in going back wherever they go, they create a lifelong collaboration, which is how we network.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Ian?
Yeah, we've skirted around the issue of Erasmus and Erasmus Plus, and Professor Fitt has talked about the potential opportunity of an Erasmus Plus, which would potentially attract students and allow us to send students all around the world. But at the moment, Erasmus Plus is a hope and aspiration that if the UK limits freedom of movement, that we could retain access to the current Erasmus Plus programme.
I think that's rather unclear, and it depends on the Brexit negotiations and how they turn out. But I do think, of course, we would encourage the government to prioritise the retention of access to Erasmus Plus in whatever settlement it reaches. How much money we spend on Erasmus Plus, I'm not sure at the moment. I'm not sure what value it would be to divert. For ECF, I am sure that we're spending more money on that than we get back. So that's an easy sum. I'm not sure how it works for Erasmus Plus.
I'm not sure either. I do know we are a big player within the Erasmus Plus networks, and I think one of the other things which I think is key here is to remember that actually there will be an impact on all of these European networks by not having the UK as part of their delivery profile in terms of where they are. You know, a lot of European students want to come and spend time in the UK. A lot of UK students do go out and want to spend time in Europe, and getting that first international experience, which might be the first step to them going much more global in terms of where they go to. So I do think there is, you know, it's a key part of the portfolio that we should argue to retain. But as Alistair said, I think that the other benefit would be if we could also have a global equivalent.
What we do know, can I just say, we can look at the example of Switzerland, because they've been through some similar things that we have. They were forced essentially to set up their own version of Erasmus Plus following their decision to limit freedom of movement. And this, I think, in 2016 cost them about £20 million. And I think 90% of that £20 million was for use on mobility. But the Swiss government obviously decided to fund both outbound and inbound students as well. So although I don't know exactly how much it would cost, the Swiss figure of 20 million is not a huge amount.
I'm going to go slightly off piste here, because in my earlier questions I was asking you to talk about the advantages of our membership of the European Union over the last 40 years for higher education. Can any of you think of any particular disadvantages of our membership of the European Union for higher education over that period?
So for me, one of the things that we did lose was that nice and easy flow of clinicians and clinician science from Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. We had, you know, really good collaborations, which hopefully in this Brexit climate might be reinvented, because that movement of English-speaking medicine was actually a casualty of joining Europe.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that I'd extend it beyond just medicine, actually. I think in some ways being part of Europe has made doing certain things easier, because you're in Europe, the collaborations exist, the agreements exist, the legal costs have been simplified in some ways. But I think there is, you know, the opportunity now to really go out and globally set up activity, which we probably would have done if we hadn't found it easier to do it within Europe.
And I would just add that some of the EU programmes, while we have been great beneficiaries of them, come with really quite significant bureaucratic strings attached, which is one of the downsides of any collaboration with anything to do with the European Union. And I just say, in terms of an earlier question about, you were asking about Erasmus, and that the EU might still want to have the UK as partners because our universities are so excellent. I would go a bit further than that. My colleagues who sit on the ERC, the European Research Council board, say that the ERC is very keen to retain British input because we are the leaders in the field. We set the standards, and they are very keen to have British scientists on board, both scientists and social scientists on board, to ensure the quality of the research output being done in the name of the European Union. And so there may be incentives from the EU side to say, actually, we want the UK still in some of these programmes.
Okay,
Yeah.
Lillian.
Well, that leads very nicely on to my question, because all of you have talked about the vital importance of research and the way it's inextricably linked with teaching. Switzerland lost access to Horizon 2020 after it limited freedom of movement, and I was going to ask how likely it is that the UK would suffer the same fate if freedom of movement was altered in the course of Brexit negotiations. But I guess, Catharine, maybe you started to just touch on that and say you think that may be not the case?
Well, of course, this is more of a political question than a legal question, because the political question is, to what extent does the EU want to send a message that you can't have your cake and eat it? It may be that individual bits of the EU, for example, the European Research Council, say we really want the British universities, British input, because they really add significant value to what we do. But the political imperatives might be operating at a different level. So, and I'm not in a position to comment on that. I'm a lawyer.
Can I just say that, of course, there has been a recent decision to readmit Switzerland as an associated country of Horizon 2020, which essentially has been the result of a decision by the country not to fully implement its referendum result, known in some circles as the Boaty McBoatface option. And so actually they're back in Horizon 2020.
All right.
They are.
They are.
And I think overall, because they just saw the overall benefit of being that associate member and being able to more easily play within the environment.
Okay. If we're unable to continue in Horizon 2020 or its successor, what should the big government be doing now to determine what
I
type
think the
of...
industrial strategy is the biggest opportunity in terms of our home market, in terms of what we're doing. I also think the negotiations that will need to take place outside of Europe with individual countries in terms of collaborations and setting up agreements, and whether they're bilateral or regional agreements to actually take activity forward, is going to be a key mitigator. I mean, if you look at Horizon 2020, there was a document published in 2011 which basically went to the European Council, which explained why Horizon 2020 was important. In there were things like scale, opportunity to operate it and take things forward. You couldn't do it at a single member state. There were opportunities around access to expertise. Really, what the government needs to do is look at what those reasons were for having Horizon 2020 in the first place, and make sure we've got an equivalence in our approach to maintain the benefits that is seen by having a Horizon 2020 type programme in our own way. If you look at the formation of UKRI in the UK, the development of the industrial strategy, really both of those need to take cognizance of why Horizon 2020 was put in place in the first place.
What would be critical is having a transitional arrangement immediately. And the government must be held to actually deliver what will not be a solution straight away. They will need transitional arrangements, and for Horizon 2020 there will need to be a plan that transitions us into whatever it's going to end up being.
I mean, the biggest waste, if you like, if we're not careful, is that there are some of these research programs that have been going now for 15, 20 years, actually, and they're getting to a point where you're really seeing large benefits coming from some of those joint collaborations. What you don't want to do is walk away from the party at that point, because that really, going backwards, would be a significant waste of investment.
Can I just make a point about funding? Of course, if you were to say, okay, we've had the negotiations, you can't be in Horizon 2020 or Framework Programme 9, what are we going to do instead? Obviously, we could try to do something. We could self-fund a programme that would try to replicate Horizon 2020's benefits. We could do something as part of an industrial strategy, a wider international research and education strategy. We could look at promoting research collaboration opportunities, for example, through the new Department of International Trade, but you wouldn't be able to get away from the fact that, of course, currently we get more out of Horizon 2020 than we put in. That, of course, is not the same as European structural funding. I think the figure at the moment is we get only about 30% of what we put in to European structural funding. So if European structural funding was the issue and you wanted to establish, I don't know, a British growth fund or something like that, then that should be possible to act as a replacement, and we would maybe save some money there.
But immediately we need an inventory. And things like the CRIC have just been set up, just opened last month. 66% of people will be coming from Europe to work there. Yes. Culham, where the nuclear physics are, the whole need to decommission a nuclear reactor there. Harwell, synchrotron, Sanger, major genomic centre for Europe. Our interactions with this infrastructure means that there's got to be a transitional plan to keep that all moving forward for the world if we're not just going to be part of Europe.
So if that funding is still there, will those people still come?
Well, I think I'm right in thinking 60-70% of the people at Culham are from Europe, and certainly the projection at the CRIC and at the Royce Institute near Manchester for materials, the expectation is 2/3 will be from Europe.
And so we've got to have the ability. It goes back to the whole freedom of movement of people, goes back to the way in which funding is accessed and which it's brought together, and the ease at which it happens.
And again, whether it's the students or the staff, we wish to see the best people coming here without let or hindrance.
I think you might have already answered this question, which is should the government reevaluate how domestic funding is allocated if the UK loses access to Horizon 2020? Is there anything you want to add to what said earlier?
Other than it's got to keep with the highest quality as the determinant of funding.
And I mean, looking at sort of one final question really is, are you concerned about the financial sustainability of any universities as a result of Brexit?
I think that each university is going to have to look at its model. Some, I'm sure, institutions will reduce in size and scale in terms of where they are. Others will probably grow. That's the market as the market is. Some universities are now already very global in terms of their operations and probably already have the networks in place to enable them to continue that growth quite easily. Others will have to revisit their model of operation. As Alistair said, the issue is not just for universities at the moment about whether it reduces the number of EU students. Demographically, UK student numbers are in decline also. So, you know, it's important for universities per se just to look at where their sort of model of customer base comes from.
7 of the top 10 universities in Europe are in the UK, and they do that because of the quality of the students that come from all over the world. We must not lose that advantage.
Can I just make one other point? I think it's often forgotten that when now Lord Willits introduced £9,000 fees for UK students, a key part of that calculation about what the level of fee should be was based on the supposition that the number of international and European students did not change. I think people forget that sometimes.
Okay, thank you, Lillian. John and the others, to some extent, it'd be very interesting if the specific examples of research programmes have been going on for a decade or more, which have, through the connections we've been talking about, which have actually also had some connections with what we term the industrial strategy or business opportunities, because that would help us to get a handle on some of the advantages.
Well, sorry, I was just going to say the examples that Alistair has already mentioned.
Yeah.
We are in a particularly in this area here, and south of here, Harwell, Jet, Culham, Synchrotron, Diamond, we have possibly the greatest concentration of world-class research institutes that are largely staffed by European staff, as in the country. As
A bit more detail, a bit more context would be really helpful.
No problem.
I think
By letter, if that's possible.
I mean, one of the big areas which we should be looking at is around automotive research, of which there's been masses of that coming out from framework programs, and that is again a key element for us and a huge part of any industrial strategy as it moves forward.
Again, evidence will be really helpful.
Fine.
Thank you very much.
Okay,
I want to thank all 4 of you for a very informative and constructive session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Focus more on the academic disciplines that might be affected. Right, could the witnesses come to the panel, please?
Oh, that's a nice breeze.
What about when the doors are in there? Oh, it's staying. scanned it like that.
And
Yeah.
there are folks that mine was tartan, maybe that's what it was. BBC Politics.
Oh, what's it saying?
Oh, well, it's about 170,000 expats using foreign health services and all that. Very small numbers here. Well, European health services and only very few Europeans using the NHS. Now, whether that's England or Scotland, I'm not sure. Whether it's across both NHSs,
Yeah, no, I've just seen it here. Too much of a good thing.
It's quite a job.
Lost one of our witnesses.
yeah.
You're obsessed with that sort of thing since that prison experience yesterday.
I did read your evidence.
If this had been in the Commons, would have the sergeant at arms out looking for them by now? Just after 1:30. I think my head's in here half.
Right, well, good morning and welcome to our second session of this inquiry. We are exploring the implications that Brexit might have for the university sector. The first session was primarily institutions. This session is primarily academic disciplines, but we're basically asking the same kind of questions. So could you, from the left, my left, say who you are and from where you hail from?
Yes, I'm Dr. Anne Corbett. I'm a political scientist, currently an associate of LSE Enterprise, former visiting fellow of LSE's European Institute and active on a rapporteur on LSE's commission on the future of Britain in Europe.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Stephanie Haywood. My day job is Head of Electrical and Electronic Engineering at the University of Hull, but I'm here representing the Engineering Professors Council, of which I'm the current president. We represent 81 higher education institutions that run engineering courses across the whole discipline spectrum.
Thank you.
My name's Lyndal Roper. I'm Regius Professor of History here at the University of Oxford, so I'm a jobbing historian.
My name is Margret Wintermantel. I'm a psychologist, professor for psychology, and at the moment the president of the German Academic Exchange Service. Perhaps you know this organization. It is an organization of a member organization of the German universities and student bodies, and we support about 120,000 scholars per year with governmental money. So we are interested in all this academic exchange business.
Okay.
My name is Georg Krawietz. I'm from the same institution, the DAAD, and represent the DAAD here in London since September 2014.
Okay, well, thank you all very much indeed for coming along. I'm going to kick off with the question is, as academics, where do you think Brexit will have the biggest impact on your work? Stephanie?
I think, well, it depends on the outcome of the negotiations, but I think the two biggest areas of concern for us are membership of the framework programme, Horizon 2020 and its successors. Particularly as engineering, engineering education underpins the engineering industry in this country, which is 50% of our exports, 280 billion a year to the GVA of the country. And it supports, that research supports the delivery of high quality research-informed programmes. And it's a kind of a virtuous circle, really, because these programmes attract overseas students to study. And as well as the economic value, I think it brings us influence in the world. It brings us, we educate people who we then collaborate with and who become political leaders outside as well.
So you see a direct connection between Brexit and engineering through this process?
I think there's a very direct connection from the second strand, which is actually to do with mobility. Currently, Engineering UK are reporting 40,000 gap in people going into the engineering industry. That's at the graduate level, at level 4+. So that's not counting technician level and below that. So this is a very big gap, and it appears to be growing. It's gone up this year compared to last year. And I don't see how we're going to fill that gap from our own resources entirely. I mean, we're doing lots of things to try to encourage more people to take up physics and STEM subjects. We're trying to get more women into engineering. But I don't see these things as being very quick fixes. And I think it's going to be very difficult to fill the gap other than by recruiting engineers from overseas. And that includes the EU.
With the rest of your disciplines in mind, what thoughts do you have which are in addition to Stephanie's? Yeah.
Well, in history and in the humanities generally, I'm worried about research collaboration. Research collaboration is an abstract thing, but what it actually means is relationships between researchers and different kind of ideas and different research projects, and they don't happen overnight. They have to be built up very gradually, and over the past generation, that's what's happened. And it's led to a lot of originality, innovation, and learning from people who've been formed in different intellectual contexts. And so my concern is, I guess, that unless we're very careful, and I'm sure there are positive things that we can do, but unless we're very careful, I think that whole research ecology could be damaged. So that's my concern.
Anne?
Well, I'm going to give a two-part answer. I'm a researcher with a particular interest in policy change over history. I've looked at how the higher education has been an issue in Europe, in European politics. And so actually I have a sort of slightly laid-back view that this is another very interesting example of what is happening, how ideas and institutions will match, how they're affected by events and the kind of framing, which is the way the issues are framed. And my colleague Claire Gordon, with whom I produced evidence, I think would back this very strongly in saying she is director of LSE's Teaching and Learning Centre. This framing and this issue of values which are at stake in whatever Brexit outcome we're going to see is crucial.
You mean in your research-intensive institutions? For instance, in the Russell Group, you have 20% EU EU researchers who are very happy to be here because they have good conditions, they have good cooperations, and it is very important. And I think in the STEM subjects like biology, physics, and mathematics, you have 23% of EU nationals, so you would lose. I mean, we would say from the German perspective, the British government should guarantee the current status of EU national academics at United Kingdom universities. And furthermore, the freedom of movement for academics from EU nationality who wish to join UK universities in the future should be secured, and obstacles should be avoided. This is really a question of quality. I mean, we heard it in the last session. This would benefit all parties involved, the UK's higher education institutions and their reputation, as well as academics of every nationality, including the British and their respective international careers. So it is important to stay attractive for the young researchers.
So what's the view of HE institutions in Germany about the potential effect of Brexit?
I don't know with which point I should begin, but I think very important are these networks of researchers that were developed in the last 30 years. With regard to the European Research Council, with regard to Horizon 2020, we have a lot of publications in cooperation between German and British researchers and other researchers. So the quality of the research, we fear in our Max Planck, Helmholtz, and of course in the DAD, we fear that the quality of research will Schaden nehmen will be because of this psychological situation of very good teamwork, very good teams, and a very coherent scene of young researchers, especially in these fields which are very much dependent upon a certain infrastructure of laboratory instruments and all this.
Yes.
Sorry, I wonder if I could just pick up on what the collaboration idea. I did try to put a value on collaboration because I think we talk about it as being a useful thing and it is a great addition. But if you just take something like the Framework 7 programme, the last programme, the UK got £8.8 billion from that, of which the majority went to universities. If you wanted to look at what the value to the UK of that was, 47% of that were collaborative programmes with typically 6 partners. So if you multiply that up and just say, we got all of the intellectual property, we got all that research, we didn't just get the research that was done by the UK institutions, it's worth 29.5 billion. And then we haven't paid for the training of those staff, we haven't paid for the equipment that they've used, and then there's the added value of the research ecosystem, which you talk about. But if you wanted to try to put a value on it, it's many times what we actually receive in actual income.
So the multiplier effect is what you're really talking about there.
But there's one, from our perspective, the most important thing is that we fear that the number of German students who love to go to United Kingdom will, I mean, they have problems. We hear this, we listen to these discussions. What will happen when we have not the opportunity to go to the British universities? I mean, this is a question you should have in mind.
George, have you got any thoughts?
There was the international student body although this term was not used. I would like to have a closer look at it. We now have about roughly close to 30% EU students within the international student body. So they contribute academically highly. If you talk to academics, they say you cannot replace these people with students from other countries, not in time-wise and possibly not quality-wise, because they may pay less fees, but they contribute intellectually and academically on a very, very high level. And it's this balanced student body from all over the world, including the EU, that makes the quality of international education at UK universities, in some respects, so valuable. If you have too many people from one certain cultural, language, cognitive background, most academics would argue that academic work cannot be done as easily as it can be with a balanced group of UK students, European, and from other part of the world students. So I think this term of internationally balanced classroom, which is quite frequently used by academics themselves, is something that could be added to the discussion so far happening.
Okay. Stephanie, can I just ask you, you've talked rightly about the importance of STEM subjects and the relationships across the European Union, but do you think there are opportunities globally, so to speak, with Brexit for engineering and manufacturing?
I think opportunities is a difficult word. I don't think there are new opportunities. I think there will be new drivers because if you take away the opportunities some of the opportunities that are in the EU, then we will automatically turn to different areas. And I think those opportunities largely exist already, many of them. So I think an extension of things like the Newton programme, which I've been involved in with Malaysia, and I think you could have similar programmes with other countries and more broadly, not just developing countries. I think that would be, I mean, it's an opportunity. We could do it anyway, but it is definitely something that could happen. I think what would be very important if we were to leave the framework programmes would be to get more involved with industry, with UK industry and business, because I think one of the things that the EU funds more deeply and more widely than the research councils is applied research. And that's one of the reasons I think that it's more widely spread regionally. So I think there are many universities who, outside of Oxford and Cambridge and London get a lot of European funding as well. But if you look at a regional map of where the EU funding goes, it's spread more widely across the regions. And I think some of that is to do with the fact that it does applied research with local companies. And I think that would be a very important route that we had to take if we were to lead the framework programme.
Is there a case for arguing that because we're in the European Union, that actually gives our universities a bigger reach globally?
Yes, I think there is. I mean, a colleague of mine has funding under the Marie Curie programmes for bringing Chinese researchers into the UK.
Lyndal, you nodded. Is that something you think?
Yes, I think it's been hugely helpful to us, and it has made us much more important globally because of all the connections that it creates and the possibilities of co-authoring and of linking up with other research institutions globally. It's been hugely important, and it's been important for the way in which people think. It's been important cognitively, and the point that was made about the importance of working with people with other languages, I think, is very important too, because of the different ways that then helps you organise knowledge conceptually.
Now, and you're a political scientist, and presumably all of the political activity is of fascination to you, and actually quite, in some respects, a basis of opportunity for more research work, because you're going to have an awful lot to look at and to think about. But my question to you would be, do you think that there is a case for sort of attempting to replicate the sort of structures we heard about in the first session in connection with Erasmus? And I'm not talking about the programme itself, but the networks and the relationships.
In terms of a more global picture.
To deal with the impact of Brexit.
Well, I actually echo what has been said before, that that it's extraordinarily important to have these networks. Europe has benefited by proximity, shared culture, and the 40 years of work together. And so that I don't think anything is impossible, but actually what I think one should never underestimate is how institutional resources, financial resources, match an idea and a political will. So I think that, you know, what one's seeing already, I mean, you know, the Anglosphere cooperation and others, these are things that can be built up, but they don't have anything like the facilities that underpin European cooperation. Could I actually make a slightly more conceptual point about the opportunities of Brexit? I think one of the things is that it offers an opportunity to actually think of the fundamental ideas of why the UK, as indeed our European neighbours, engage in European international cooperation, and why students, faculty and researchers want the freedom to study and work in another country, and we've emphasised how fortunate that is. Now, what actually that's saying is this can't be measured simply in cost-benefit terms. And I think for two reasons we should be thinking, therefore, about the values of what's happening in education and the relationship between teaching and research. But I think there's a big social point as well. I think Brexit offers or demands efforts now to reconcile a significant part of the public with its universities as institutions of which the British should be proud, and not simply elite or experts or ivory towers which have very little connection with the real world. Okay. And I think also that we should be thinking about our youth in this, who, as we know, are very internationally minded and European minded.
Thank you. Marion?
I think I'm going to be further probing on potential benefits for academia post-Brexit. So do we have any further thoughts? Anything else you'd like to add to what's already been touched on?
I would like to add to the comments with regard to the social perspective. I think you may know that there is the European University Association, and the British universities play a major role in this association. And these discussions with regard to the further development of the higher education system in Europe profits very much from the discussions in this European University Association. And I think it would be really a loss for British universities and for the other European universities too, when these discussions with regard to the further development of research and teaching and education would become more difficult. This would be really damaging.
Catherine? Stephanie, sorry.
Yeah. I think it's quite difficult to give an answer because we don't really know what the shape of the negotiations and what the outcome is going to be. So, but I think the two drivers would definitely be towards what I would like the government to do, I suppose, would be to try to encourage greater industry involvement, in particularly in engineering research. Of course, that's my side of things. And I think we would also need to put in place some kinds of programmes for collaboration with Europe and with the wider world. I worry about the word opportunities. I think I think they would be drivers. I think we would have to do these things if we wish to maintain our universities with their current global standing.
Lyndal, I think you were.
Well, I think we need to think about opportunities, yes, and we also need to think about conservation. Because I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think it's a choice of either Europe or the global world. It's that we want both and to maintain what we've achieved with Europe, I think is essential so that we can build and reach out globally, which is something that we already do. But as we do that, I think that the challenge that this offers is that we as a nation have to think about how much money we put into research, because effectively we are going to be losing research money that we now have, and that's a challenge. And so I think we need to think about our national priorities. And even in humanities, which is where I work, you might think that all these European connections might not be that important, that research projects might not be so important, but they're absolutely crucial to us. and they come out in the way that we teach our students as well. So it's about our whole intellectual culture. Very much so in humanities. We need to be able to replace the money that we're losing. Just in Oxford alone, that's going to be 17 million that we'll lose for humanities in European funding. And that's a challenge that we need to think about creatively so that we can conserve this research ecology that we've created and reach out. But that will require thinking about how we're going to create new possibilities for research funding.
Okay.
Do you think that the idea of when Brexit happens, do you think there's a possibility for more collaboration and links beyond Europe? Because we're very focused on Europe at the moment. Do you think it will encourage, it will be possible to move further into Australasia, Far East, wherever, India?
I think we already have. We already do that. We already have very strong networks. I think if resources are made available so that it's easier, and one of those things, I like very much the idea of creating an Erasmus++, that would be global, because I think that's something that our students and our young academics really need. It's the personal connections and it's the personal experience of spending time outside Britain, working with people in very different intellectual cultures, that gives people new creativity. But for that to happen, we would have to have a really vibrant Erasmus++ scheme. And that, I think, would be a real possibility. But it's got to be done with conserving those links with Europe that we already have and not replacing one with another.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'd come in on that and say, actually, it's not just a question of Erasmus Plus and expanding that. But one of the things we know about the why European cooperation has worked is that it has matched the idea of collaboration with institutional frameworks and political deals that are acceptable. You know, there's been a long route from intergovernmental cooperation which wasn't very effective, which needed a kind of infrastructure behind it. And of course, as we also know, there's education is not education is treated as a subsidiary area. So again, that's encouraging cooperation. And I think that what we've seen as a very positive thing, which I do not see replicated in any other part of the world, is the establishment of the European higher education area and the European research area. So, you know, the knowledge, the Europe of knowledge. And what that is doing is has produced in Europe a kind of common language about quality assurance, the importance of staff involvement and external review, a language about recognition, which, for example, the ASEAN countries talk about but can't do. The Latin American countries collaborate in a ministerial way, but they can't do either. And I think that that's something one needs to assess very seriously and say, you know, that's part of why one doesn't want to lose the European links. One wants to be able to use them to extend into these other areas.
When you say can't do Latin America, other areas can't do, can you be more specific?
Well, I think it's absolutely a political decision.
Right.
European ministers, some more enthusiastic than others, about the need for commissions of support. This was a huge row in the 1960s, the 1970s, and really came to a more sort of consensual state in the 1990s, you know, when it was becoming obvious education was really becoming much more globalised. And there is a balance, and actually we have to thank the British government for the idea of the open method of coordination, which of course is sort of voluntary. And that actually deflated a great political tension.
I think you also have to look at the practicalities. Just it's much easier to collaborate with your immediate neighbours. You can get on a train, and even from Hull, I can get on a train, and I can be in Paris very, very quickly. And there are a lot of infrastructure facilities, the European synchrotron facility, CERN, the laser facilities at Harwell, the whole range of joint infrastructure that's been built up over very many years. And I would just make one other point about that, is that we pay into that not through the EU, but we actually get to use it through EU funding. So I think one thing we really need to consider is we may be paying for some of these facilities as a nation, but not through the EU because they're not supported by the EU, but then have restricted access to them because much of our access has been through projects funded by the EU. So there's a lot of things like this that need consideration.
Okay, thanks, Marion. Lillian.
University success, not just British universities, depends on being able to attract the brightest and the best students and researchers. And you talked, George, about the importance of building diverse teams and how that adds value. The government has said that it wants to win the global battle for talent. So following Brexit, is that still possible? Who wants to go?
Well, actually, I'd like to come in on that because, of course, it's a very attractive idea. And you look at the league tables and you see how well Britain does, and there is no other country, though Germany and Netherlands have very high-ranking universities. But actually, when you look at what is produced, you do have to ask whether, Cambridge is doing what it's doing or Oxford is doing what it's doing on its own. And the answer is it's not. The research results, the figures were quoted this morning, the very high-ranking results come from collaborative work. So, it's Cambridge and it's Strasbourg, or it's Oxford and it's Nice. So much of it is collaborative work. So I think we have to look, slightly sceptically about the going it alone.
So are you suggesting it isn't just about attracting students and staff, but it's actually about the quality of the connections and collaborations that they have?
Well, I'm saying that what we know is that the most effective and highly cited research is very largely collaborative work, and what's more, it is cross-national collaborative work. Okay. And so the merit ought to be shared. And perhaps it's fair to look at Europe in terms of if you look at the first 200 universities as opposed to the first 10, Europe scores better than anywhere else in the world.
I think to continue the Manchester United analogy from this morning, I think you can have a very good team member like Wayne Rooney, but you need the rest of the team. And so I think that's really very important. Research is a team sport. But to pick up what you were saying about freedom of movement, I think although European staff are only 15% of academic staff, I think they are 15% of very talented staff. Only 30% of our PhD students in engineering are UK students. And we're very heavily reliant on postgraduates going into the high end, if you like, of engineering. So I think it's really important that the government gives out and some of the problems at the moment are not to do with things that have actually happened, but to do with attitudes. So, for example, while some of my colleagues report problems with being excluded from EU collaborations, what I've personally heard most is colleagues coming to me and saying, I'm thinking of leaving the country because my wife is German, Spanish, French, our children don't have a UK passport, we need to sort this out one way or the other. So it isn't just the staff that we employ that are affected by freedom of movement, it's their partners and their families. So, and I think this is an amplifying factor that we haven't really considered.
But have you modelled in any way what you expect? I mean, particularly given those very stark figures about how many non-UK students are needed in engineering, have you modelled what you think the impact will be in different scenarios?
We haven't as an organisation. I know that the Royal Society are working on that. They have got some preliminary data, but I think it's at a relatively early stage at the moment. But I haven't got any hard numbers. But I can look at areas, for example. I don't think it will affect our undergraduate courses too much, but you can say that Imperial College and Cranfield have typically about 30% postgraduate students. from the EU, non-UK EU. That's got to make a big difference to their income from those courses. Will those students come if they have to pay international fees? I don't know.
Yep.
Sorry.
I have some hard numbers.
Oh, right.
It's a fact sheet from the EUA, from the European University Association, and they write the UK is the most productive country in Europe in terms of scientific output, and 1 in 4 UK publications is done in collaboration with a European partner. I think this is... And over 330,000 publications were produced from collaborations between UK and European researchers between 2003 and 2011. So I think this is quite good. It gives a good impression with regard to the qualification.
Lyndal, sorry.
I'd echo absolutely what Stephanie said. I'm hearing the same kinds of things. And I think immediately what we need is some kind of reassurance for, in Russell groups, it's 20% of the staff who come from the EU. And this is really important because we don't want to lose these internationally leading people, and it does have this amplifying effect. And I think it's a real worry, and clarity on that issue would be very helpful at this point. And then collaborative work, we talk a lot about it, but just to give you an example of what that might mean, in history, where you might think that collaboration is not so important, one of the projects we have here is a Global Cultures of Knowledge project. And what that does is it looks at the 17th century, it's a period of intellectual change and innovation, and it's involved scholars from 33 countries. And it's a way of understanding how does an intellectual culture work. So it's using network analysis, and it's raising new questions about how intellectual change happens and how that happens through contacts and networks. And that's possible because of European funding. So even in history, this is changing how we think about historical change.
Sorry,
I was just going to say, could I underline what was said about the position of academics and how this relates to families? LSE, in fact, I think it is a third of the staff who are European citizens. Other non-UK European citizens, I should stress. And I think that the issue we're talking about here is actually one which requires government intervention, and it requires it before the negotiations start. And I would say that were the government to come out of its kind of purdah, or whatever it's called, and to say that from the start, it would be creating a much more positive climate to assure that EU citizens here were safe, which in the end is helpful all round, because there is not a single European country which wants to see a zero-sum game. What one is actually looking for in the end are solutions to this, not to really collapse before the problem.
Ian, you've got a quick supplement.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in terms of trying to sort of gain the advantage in terms of the global battle for talent, I mean, I'm particularly concerned about provincial universities, because an awful lot of provincial universities have developed links with European countries based on easy transport links. You know, for instance, Newcastle University or Northumbria University might well be able to use the transport links which exist via Newcastle Airport to fly into Germany or into Eastern Europe or anywhere in Western Europe quite easily. But those links aren't as easily developed from provincial universities, you know, via the sort of hub airports in the southeast of England. Have you got any particular concerns about that?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the whole ease of European cooperation has been immensely helpful, and these are the things that we've got to conserve. And it needs hard thought to make sure that that it's clear that European cooperation will continue. Because what happens is it's incremental. People worry about the immigration position, then people start not to use us as collaborators in research project applications because they're unclear whether funding will continue or not and what our status will be in relation to all these European research programs. and it's very damaging.
But I think the problem is, if you're on the other side of the argument in terms of people looking at what are the potential opportunities, possibly some people might read into the ease of those opportunities which have existed in the past as being the lazy options which have existed in the past. I know it's made a bit sort of harsh, but it might think that we've taken the easy options, might be the lazy options in terms of what could have really been done in the past. Do you think that's any truth in that?
No, I don't think so, because what's important is the making of those links and the intellectual diversity that comes as a result of that. And one of the really important things is linguistic diversity that is involved in all this cooperation. It's not that easy to cooperate with Europe because it requires openness to new ideas, different ways of doing things, and in some aspects, a culture which is not like British culture. It's a very diverse range of different cultures. Cooperation with the US is easier in some ways because it's the same language, but there are all kinds of challenges, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that you have to choose between Europe and outside Europe. You want to do both and.
Yeah. I think the point you make about the provincial universities is very important. Just before the referendum, EPC actually produced a document with some maps of where EU funding went across Britain. And I'm coming from Hull. We have quite strong links with the Netherlands. And my experience is generally people in Holland have a better idea of where Hull is than most people in the rest of the UK. They usually put it about where Newcastle is. So
where's that then?
So I actually think it's very unlikely, even if I don't think we would gain anything like the same benefit in either the distribution of the funding or the value of the funding if the government were to replace that £9 billion. That's what I was trying to explain earlier. I think it would cost a lot more than that to get the same value that we get from the EU framework projects.
Okay, back on track with Lillian, but George just wants to make a point.
To our experience, the competition for putting academic staff on certain positions as a professor, reader, whatever, is competition-based. So you are looking for quality. The EU citizenship comes as a benefit, but I don't experience processes that we are aware of to be decisively done because of the fact that somebody's coming from the EU. You're looking for the best and brightest people. If you have two people of the same quality, it's of course then easier to put somebody from Europe on such a post because there may be less visa relations, etc. But it's not a crucial point of giving a certain job to a certain individual because it's from the Netherlands instead of, let's say, Thailand or China.
Okay. You've all touched on the issues around free movement, and I think, Margaret, you've said previously that it will be disastrous for British and European academia if mobility of students and staff was restricted. What clarity is it that's needed before negotiations start? Is it just about the position of people who are already here, or is it much more than that?
I don't know whether I understood you right.
Perspective as well. Es geht die aktuellen und die zukünftigen.
You ask you want to know how we think about the future of student mobility.
What clarity you think's needed before the Brexit negotiations start?
Yes, one should start the negotiation to show the people or to bring in the negotiation this point that the mobility that's what we were talking all together, that the mobility is really important for the quality of research and education. So for creativity, that diversity is important, and we know this, we have experiences. So perhaps we should produce, or we should show more hard numbers, more figures that can show this effect of mobility. I mean, for us in the DAAD, we have this experience since 90 years that we have, with our work, with our supporting of people from everywhere, we have good friends all over the world. So it is an effect, a sustainable effect, but it is not so easy to bring hard numbers with regard to the quality. But I thought this hard numbers of publication of cooperations of the European Research Council and the representation of the British researchers there shows that it is in the past very important that you had this mobility chances, and for the future it has to be important. And I think you have to show that this mobility will not...
I mean, I think I understand that it's clear from what the panel have already said about what the importance is and the benefits of having collaboration and mobility. I suppose the question is, as we approach the negotiations, what is it that the potential academic staff and students need to hear from our government?
I have a little soundbite for the government, and that is it should be going for an intelligent Brexit in higher education. And, you know, we don't want to get stuck on hard Brexit or soft Brexit, because that takes us into legal arguments and institutional things. But the idea of a Brexit, of an intelligent Brexit, is really trying to keep open opportunities to suggest the kind of buttons that can be pressed in this new atmosphere.
Do you mean on a sector specific, with a specific deal for the higher education sector?
You know, the ideas have to come from somewhere. What sector is better placed to put forward ideas than the higher education sector? Okay? So I think that's the starting point, that the government needs to think more broadly, to listen to what academics are saying about what universities are for, what teaching and learning is achieving, and how we best preserve that. We may have to do it in different institutional structures. We may be looking to academics to take more initiatives. I mean, the mention of provincial university. You know, there are lots of buttons to press. For example, the academic own disciplinary organisations. You know, Europe, there have been hard times in Europe before. You know, you think of the Cold War and you think of how university associations made those links between all sides of Europe. Well, I think, you know, one's needing to revive some of that spirit, some of that initiative now.
I think there are some short-term things that we do need. I think it goes without saying almost that existing staff need to know that they've got the right to remain and work in the UK, and their families as well. I think that's very important. But I think looking a bit further ahead, I would like to see the HE sector and definitely engineering removed from any limitations on freedom of movement, because I think it's essential to the UK economy. I don't see how we can, particularly, and perhaps a very specific thing, is if EU students become international students, then they're going to count towards our migration targets. I think it's absolutely vital that students are removed from the migration targets, if not from the data. I can't.
Well, we've got that plan. We're just running up against time at the moment.
Yeah.
So, Lillian?
Yeah, sorry, Lyndal, you wanted to come in.
It's just three things, really. Making the visa situation clear and exempting, continuing. We really need freedom of movement in the academic sector, and if it can be separated out, that would be really important. Then we need to remove students from immigration targets. And then the other thing that I think is in the negotiations around how we go on funding research, I think it's very important that we can negotiate the best possible deal in relation to the European Research Council and European funding streams, so that what we have is preserved. I don't know whether that means associated country status, but we need to be in there, and we need to retain as much a role in that as we can.
Okay, Georg.
Referring to the Erasmus scheme or anything that might look like or similarly in the future, there is evidence by Universities UK, who did a study about 1 year ago, that students with international experience are less likely to be unemployed for a longer time than the ones that don't have international experience. I think the UK can provide this study if you're looking for it. And we very often hear from the FCO or the Council of British Industry that they say our students need to have access to international exchange programs, because we already now suffering of internationally experienced young people who we want to send abroad and for some reason or the other lack intercultural or language skills. So be part in the Erasmus scheme and providing this opportunity to gain this experience in the future, I think, is in the interest of British students as well as institutions like the British industry or the FCO.
I mean, it's very clear from the panel that you all think that freedom of movement is really vital for, well, possibly for everything, but certainly for the higher education sector. But if there are increased restrictions, and this is particularly a question for you two, could these problems be offset by the establishment of a system of funding for academic mobility similar to you've got through DAAD? How would that help?
You mean to have an organisation like this?
To have the funding open to non-British academics?
Yes, of course. I mean, I told you that the DID exists since 1925, and it was in a time when the German science was not accepted worldwide because of the World War I. And there were 5 young students in Heidelberg who made this organization. And since this time, I mean, we see that it is a really success story with regard to research quality, with regard to the let me say personality development of the students who come to us and who go out. We support students who go out and come to and students who come.
What would be the challenges of trying to replicate it in the UK?
To replicate it, I think it's easier said than it's done. It will need time. It will need structures that take
money.
money as well. Take the best and avoid the least. If you're talking to the British Council, for instance, we are in close touch with them. They are still happy of the programs that enable them to do exchange, and they will certainly be happy to do it on a larger scale. If this would be one option, I think the British Council is in a position to be in charge of any kind of enlargement of international exchange, and we do a lot of cooperation together with them, and they I think, can make even a more strong case for international exchange than we can do, at least from the British perspective.
Yeah, but very quickly, can I just ask Lyndal, because you're obviously Australian originally, and Australia and Canada have got point-based immigration systems. They're still able to attract people to work in their higher educational institutions. So do you think changes in the UK freedom of movement to that, if we move to that sort of system, do you think that would still have a significant impact on our ability to attract talent?
That's a question that I can't answer, but my feeling is that what we absolutely must do at the moment is make sure that the staff who are here are not demoralised and don't leave, because the risk that we face is enormous. We're a global leader and we would lose some of our best talent.
Anne?
The answer, if I may, to your question is that the government needs to be told that there should be significant amounts of money put aside, somehow, perhaps that 350 million that was going to come a week or whatever.
It's going to the NHS.
And that's the thing, competition everywhere. But I mean, you will not achieve what is being talked about without a commitment to serious funding. So it's well beyond the British Council. It's actually goes to the Chancellor, the Exchequer, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lillian. Catharine?
So we've talked a lot about the freedom of movement of academics. I know that you all very much believe in the value of the freedom of movement of students as well. What do you think are the key challenges if we don't have that freedom of movement going forward? It's interesting, Stephanie, that you're looking to reply, because, because I'm aware that the Engineering Professors Council have actually said that it could ultimately result in positive benefits for the UK skill shortage. So if you could comment on that, if you're able to, that would be helpful. Would you like me to explain the context?
Yes, if you would.
in the sense that if we have less students moving from the UK to the EU, less students coming in from the EU to the UK, that it, as you say, is a driver to actually addressing the UK skill shortage and actually investing in UK skills in order to make up that shortfall.
Yeah, I don't really think that there are. I mean, it's very difficult to predict exactly what will happen. But I don't really think that at undergraduate level we're talking about 10% of the overall population, maybe slightly bigger in engineering. I don't really think that there are places that EU students are taking that would otherwise not be available to, that would be otherwise be available to home students or to international students. So I don't think I can see a positive benefit of removing those EU students.
Or even an alternative driver.
Well, I think we're already, if you talk to most engineering departments, are very heavily dependent on non-UK students anyway. So they're most
non-UK, non-EU.
Well, I use it to mean both EU, non-UK EU and international students, because and they're dependent on them financially, because overall the cost of educating engineers is in general significantly more than £9,000, even plus the 1,500 that we get from the government. So I can't see really that it's a possible driver. I think we will definitely have, of course, we are always looking overseas, both over the channel and more further afield for engineering students, because generally it's difficult for the university sector as a whole to recruit enough good engineering students.
And so on the downside, are you foreseeing, if we do have a reduction in the number of EU students that are able to come, that will potentially lead to financial challenges for universities producing those courses?
I think it could affect some courses. I don't think it will be a major. I don't think it will close whole engineering departments generally, because I say, generally speaking, EU students are still a small but growing actually percentage of our undergraduate population. So we had some statistics this year that show that in general the numbers are still holding up across the piece. So I don't think it's going to affect whole engineering departments, but I think it could affect specific courses, particularly postgraduate courses, which tend to be rather specific directions and are often very dependent on non-UK students, both from the EU and from further afield.
And on that point, that these courses are dependent on non-EU students. Why do you think that is? Why don't we have enough UK students undertaking engineering to meet our
that's the $1 million question, isn't it? If I knew that, we would have solved the problem. I think it's very difficult to know. I think it's a whole story in itself, the leaky pipeline, why not enough people take physics A-levels, why many of them drop out, why we lose probably 30% of engineers to other careers. It's quite a complicated story. I'm sure there are ways in which we could increase the number of UK people going into engineering. Some of it probably involves paying higher salaries to new engineering graduates. I don't know, but it's a very complex problem, and it's not one that I think we're going to solve from our own resources in the short term. I think, of course, we need to do all those things. We need to increase our pool of engineers, UK engineers. But I think for quite a while we're going to be dependent on recruiting engineers from outside the UK. And actually there are highly skilled, talented engineers who struggle to find jobs in some countries like Greece and Spain that I know of. And I think it would be sensible for us to use those talents and to keep them here.
It's a slightly different point. But it's to say that, you are politicians, you are MPs. You're very concerned about public opinion. I wonder whether you do have the opportunity to really sort of push the idea that underpinning international collaboration and the history we've had of European collaboration are the values of openness, tolerance, and the university's role in this, in evidence-based critique, the free circulation of ideas. And do we want to lose that? I think there is a really difficult message, a message that perhaps in the past universities haven't been too good at getting across to the public, but something that could change a bit the atmosphere to contribute to really making the government a bit more daring on the negotiations that are to take place.
And have the government sought your input in terms of its Brexit strategy?
Me personally?
Well, or any of you?
Not directly, but I think that there's definitely other organisations that we work with, the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Royal Society. These people have definitely been putting forward.
And do you feel it's been received?
I think we haven't had very much I haven't had very much feedback on that yet, so I don't know. I'm hoping that today will be
I just
one way.
have one further very practical question about languages. Because we know that one of the challenges is modern foreign languages. The entrances at GCSE and A-level are already stagnating or declining. So there is potentially an impact from Brexit in terms of the freedom of movement of language students and non-language students, but also that flow of language teachers that we know there's already a challenging environment to ensure we have sufficient modern foreign language teachers in UK schools, and that perhaps we're going to continue in a declining direction, and Brexit is going to further compound that. Professor Roper, you had...
Yes, that's a subject that is very dear to my heart. I think you're absolutely right. I think in a country where it's increasingly monoglot, one of the practical implications of the kind of thing Anne's talking about is that where you have European students mixing with the rest of your undergraduate population, they're creating friendships and they're understanding one another, and that creates links and ways of thinking that then go on and help the economy in all kinds of intangible ways. And so the issue here is, if you raise the fees to international levels, you are likely to lose a lot of that group of European students, and we're very concerned about that. And the second thing is, it's not just at undergraduate level, it's at postgraduate level too, and that's where it's just as important, and in some ways even more so, because the people who come and who move then are the ones who become the early researchers, and that impacts directly onto our intellectual culture. And in the last generation, what that has meant is that it's at graduate level that people start learning languages, and we get over some of this deficit that we have through the lack of good language teaching. So I see a real concern there as well.
Right, we're going to have to, we're mindful of time, right. Ian, a couple of questions from you.
Yeah, it's sort of crystal ball gazing to a certain extent, but what do you feel are the likely impacts of Brexit on the quality of teaching in our universities? Do you think that any risks can be mitigated by government in terms of thinking about how we actually manage the process?
In terms of the quality of teaching, well, I think we will lose high-quality staff. I think that's a problem. I mean, we've said it already, really, that we're looking for reassurance. I think clarity is actually also important on what the rules are and what they're likely to be. So,
I mean, just to clarify, this morning I heard a couple of stats that there'd been a survey done, I think, by the UCU, which showed that 42% of academics and 76% of non-UK EU academics within British universities were already considering their future in terms of leaving the UK.
I think all non-UK EU citizens and people who are married to or have partners are considering that, whereas they perhaps hadn't thought about it. I mean, that doesn't mean all of them will go, but it automatically made them consider their position. And certainly, just from my colleagues, I could name 4 or 5 people who are thinking of going, not because they are necessarily UK citizens, but because they have partners who are. And so I think there's a big knock-on effect there that we haven't really considered.
Okay.
And at the same time, there's a context, of course, of huge competition. I mean, there's not just a global labour market in academics, but I mean, there's a European competition. And we know of universities, in France and in Germany, who are extremely keen to have some of these academics back.
Would you all agree that the diversity of teaching staff is really important for the quality of teaching in the UK higher education sector?
I think it's very important. Actually, in engineering, we tend to have a lot of overseas lecturers anyway, and not just from the rest of the EU, but from China and Russia. So I think that diversity is absolutely great. What I would say, I would not like to lose the people from the EU because they bring a different perspective, and they bring actually a perspective that in some ways is actually closer to ours, and actually to some extent we sometimes have problems with some colleagues who come from further afield just in delivery of their teaching.
Would any of you know of any sort of specific examples of people from outside of the EU would have been attracted to institutions that you work with because they've got an opportunity to work here in the UK but in collaboration with other European institutions?
Well, I'm an example. I'm an Australian. I came to this country. I've worked in Germany quite a lot. And the ability that I have to work in Europe is immensely important to me and has been hugely important intellectually, and I'm very, very grateful to have had that opportunity made possible in part through organisations like the DAAD and also through British organisations. And I was attracted to come to the UK in part because of the culture of intellectual openness and what was talked about in the first session about the flatness of the UK, the possibility of being independent intellectually and of having access to this very diverse intellectual culture early on.
Right, well, you asked for an example, you've got one. One last point.
I just want to say, we in Germany, we try to get more intercultural and non-German teachers and professors. We try because we know that this is really true, that in the British universities this openness, this diversity, this creativity, this kind of dialogue between the researchers is very important for the quality.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you all very much indeed for coming before us today. It's been really interesting. This is an ongoing inquiry, so we won't be reporting anytime soon, but we will be obviously conducting more sessions, and our interest in this subject is obviously as intense as yours. So thank you all very much indeed. Order, order.